20 rifles aimed at his chest. Cass Everett sat on a winded horse in the center of a dry canyon in Arizona Territory, with 200 stolen horses behind him and 20 Apache warriors in front of him, and every single rifle was pointed at the exact place where his heart was beating too fast to count. The sun was an hour from setting. The canyon walls rose on both sides, red sandstone, 200 feet straight up, no way out except forward through the rifles or backward through 60 miles of desert he'd just crossed. He was 29 years old. He was about to be 30, or he was about to be dead, and the decision belonged to the man at the center of the line. A warrior, 50 years old, iron-gray hair cut short, a face carved by the same forces that carved the canyon: wind, sun, time, and the specific patience of a landscape that has been watching white men break promises for 30 years. He wore a blue Cavalry Scouts shirt, Army issue. The shirt said, "I have served your people." The rifle said, "I remember what your people did in return." The warrior stepped forward. 20 rifles tracked with him, not aimed at the warrior, aimed at Cass, moving with the precision of men who had tracked Geronimo's Chiricahua raiders across this same terrain and knew exactly what a bullet does at this distance. The warrior stopped 10 feet from Cass's horse. He looked at Cass. He looked at the 200 horses milling in the dust behind Cass. He looked at the brands on the horses, Apache brands, marks he recognized the way a father recognizes his children's faces. Then he looked back at Cass with the expression of a man solving an equation that has no comfortable solution. Why? One word, the only word that mattered. Why is a white man driving 200 Apache horses through a canyon on Apache land? The answer to that question would determine whether Cass Everett rode out of this canyon or was carried out. And the answer required context. 8 months of context. A contractor named Pardo. A ledger with 2 columns. A betrayal by a friend. And a decision made at midnight in a corral that turned a man who had never mattered into the most wanted horse thief in the territory. But we're getting ahead. First, the horses, and the man who stole them, and the man who stole them back. 8 months earlier. Pardo Ranch, near Globe, Arizona Territory, 1882. Cass Everett was breaking a Mustang in a corral that smelled like dust and manure, and the specific exhaustion of a man earning $4 a week doing work that was worth 10. He was nobody. The frontier had a word for men like Cass. Hand. A hired hand. The word itself tells you everything. Not a mind, not a heart, not a name. A hand. A body part attached to a tool. Cass had been a hand his entire adult life, and the role fit the way a saddle fits a horse that's been ridden too long. Not comfortable, but shaped to the weight. The ranch belonged to Lucius Pardo, civilian contractor for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, supplier of flour and beef and blankets to the White Mountain Apache Reservation, 60 miles north. Pardo was fat, loud, and prosperous in the way that men are prosperous when nobody checks their arithmetic. He wore a gold watch chain across a vest that strained at every button. He smiled constantly. The smile of a man who knows the difference between what's billed and what's delivered, and understands that the difference is profit. He had 16 ranch hands. Cass was the best with horses and the quietest with questions, which made him Pardo's favorite because a man who doesn't ask questions is a man who doesn't find answers. But Cass was about to find answers anyway, and the answers were going to cost him everything he had, which was almost nothing, which meant the cost was almost bearable. Almost. And somewhere on this ranch, a man Cass considered a friend was already watching him, already counting the questions Cass wasn't asking out loud but was thinking behind the pale blue eyes that stared at everything a little too long. The friend's name was Dooley, and Dooley owed Pardo money, and a man who owes money to the man you're about to rob is not a friend. He's a fuse. But Cass didn't know that yet. He would learn. The hard way. The only way the frontier teaches anything. I want to know how far this story traveled. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and please don't forget to subscribe. Cass Everett had never planned to be a man who mattered. His father had died at Shiloh in 1862. Union infantry, the kind of man who marched because a recruiter asked and died because a bullet didn't. His mother had died of scarlet fever in 1866. His brother Tully, 12 years old, bright, the one who was supposed to amount to something, had been kicked by a horse on a cattle drive outside Dodge City in 1874. Cass had buried him in a field with a marker made from a fence rail because a proper headstone cost money nobody had. He was 16. He walked west because walking was cheaper than staying, and grief moves lighter when the scenery changes. He worked ranches in New Mexico, freight lines in Colorado, Mustang hunts in the Tonto Basin. He ended up at Pardo's ranch in 1881 because $4 a week was one more than three, and the mathematics of survival doesn't require ambition. He was a fence post, functional, replaceable, noticed only when missing. The kind of man the frontier produced by the thousands and consumed by the hundreds without keeping records. He'd never had a moment that mattered. He'd never stood at a crossroads and chosen a direction that anyone would remember. He broke horses because horses were honest. They told you what they were thinking with their ears and their weight and the specific tension in their shoulders before they bucked. Horses didn't lie. Horses didn't have two columns. Horses were the one truthful thing in a territory built on paper deceptions and handshake frauds, and men in gold watch chains billing the government for flour they never delivered. Dooley was the closest thing Cass had to a friend. Emmett Dooley, 26, freckled, cheerful, the kind of man who made the bunkhouse bearable because he laughed at things that weren't funny, and the laughter was contagious even when the joke was missing. They'd worked together for a year. They shared tobacco. They played cards on Saturday nights, small stakes, penny ante, the gambling of men who couldn't afford to lose. Dooley was good company. Dooley was also in debt to Pardo. $70 for a horse he'd bought on credit, and a doctor's bill from the time he'd broken his arm falling off a fence. $70 was 4 months of wages. The debt sat on Dooley the way all frontier debt sat, like a stone in a boot, present, constant, shaping every step. Cass didn't know that the debt made Dooley dangerous. He didn't know that debt turns friends into instruments. He didn't know that a man who owes $70 to your enemy will sell you for $71. He knew horses. And in the summer of 1882, 200 Apache horses arrived at Pardo's ranch driven by Pardo's men, and Cass watched them come through the gate and saw the brands and asked the question that would cost him his job, his safety, and the only friendship he had. "Where'd these horses come from?" he asked Dooley. Dooley's face changed, not dramatically. A flicker, the briefest tightening around the eyes, the micro-expression of a man who knows the answer and knows that knowing the answer makes him complicit. "Reservation," Dooley said. "Debt collection." 2 words, spoken too quickly. The way people speak when they want the words out of their mouth before the taste settles. And Cass, who had spent his entire life being a fence post, being a hand, being the quiet man who didn't ask questions, filed Dooley's flicker the way he filed a horse's ear movement. Information. The animal is telling you something. Pay attention. He found the ledger 3 weeks later, not through cunning, through accident, the same blunt instrument that had shaped his entire life. Pardo rode to Globe for supplies, left the office unlocked. Cass walked in to deliver a mule sale receipt, and the ledger was open on the desk like a confession waiting for a reader. 2 columns. The left column, deliveries billed to the United States government for the White Mountain Apache reservation. The right column, deliveries actually made. Flour billed at 80,000 pounds. Delivered, 42,000. Beef billed at 30,000 pounds. Delivered, 18,000. Blankets, tools, coffee, sugar. Every line the same story. The billed amount roughly double the delivered amount. Pardo was charging the government for twice what he sent and pocketing the gap. The gap was the profit. The profit was measured in Apache families receiving half the food they were promised. Half the flour, half the beef, half the blankets. People starving on paper that said they were fed. But the page that stopped Cass, the page that made his hands shake, was dated June 1882. Livestock seizure, 200 head, valued at $20 per head, $4,000 credited against outstanding balance. The outstanding balance was the unpaid portion of the fake billings. Pardo had created a debt by overbilling for food he didn't deliver, then collected on the fictional debt by seizing the Apache's horses. The horses were payment for air. 200 animals taken from people who had already lost their land, their freedom, and their ability to feed themselves. Taken as payment for a lie told in a ledger with 2 columns that nobody had checked because nobody checks the math when the victims can't read the numbers. Cass closed the ledger. He stood in the office. His heart was doing something unfamiliar, beating not from exertion but from recognition. He knew what it felt like to be the smaller column. $3 a week when the work was worth 10. A dead brother buried with a fence rail. A lifetime of being the number that doesn't add up in someone else's arithmetic. He didn't know the Apache. He'd never been to the reservation. But he knew the math. And the math was the same math everywhere. The strong billing for what they didn't deliver. The weak paying for what they didn't receive. And the gap between the two measured in horses and hunger, and the specific silence of people whose complaints are filed in a drawer. He walked out of the office. He went back to breaking horses. He didn't tell Dooley what he'd seen. Something about the flicker, the tightening around the eyes when Cass had asked about the horses, told him Dooley already knew. And a man who already knows and hasn't told you is a man who has chosen his side. But Cass didn't want to believe that. Dooley was his friend. Friends don't choose sides against friends, except when they owe $70 to the man on the other side. Cass spent 3 months watching, learning the corral layout, the patrol schedules, the canyon routes north. 3 months of being a fence post while building something behind the blank expression. And on the night of September 14th, 1882, while Pardo was in Tucson meeting with the Bureau of Indian Affairs about a new contract, Cass Everett opened the corral gates at midnight. 200 horses, 1 man, 60 miles of desert between the ranch and the reservation, and the only person who saw him leave was Dooley. Standing in the bunkhouse doorway, watching his only friend ride into the dark with 200 horses, and the expression on Dooley's face, visible for 1 second in the moonlight before Cass turned north and the darkness swallowed him, was not surprise. It was calculation. The face of a man doing math. $70 of debt against whatever Pardo would pay for the information that Cass Everett just stole his herd. Dooley went back inside. Cass rode north, and the fuse was lit. 200 horses in the dark. The Sonoran desert floor stretching flat and silver under a half moon. the Pinal Mountains to the east, a dark wall of rock blocking the stars on the horizon. The air smelled like creosote and dust and the specific metallic tang of desert night when the ground releases the heat it stored all day. Cass sat on a horse he didn't own, wearing clothes he'd earned at $4 a week, driving a herd that belonged to people he'd never met toward a reservation he'd never visited. The mathematics of the situation were simple. He was committing a hanging offense. Horse theft in Arizona Territory in 1882 was not a metaphor. It was a rope. He knew the herd. He'd broken half these horses himself over the past year, not knowing they were Apache horses, not knowing they were stolen, just knowing they were good animals that deserved better handling than Pardo's men provided. He used the knowledge now. The lead mare, a buckskin with a star blaze, set the pace. The stallions flanked. The younger horses filled the middle. He didn't push. Pushing 200 horses in the dark creates noise, and noise carries in the desert like a gunshot through a canyon. He guided with pressure and release, riding to one flank to nudge the herd left, dropping back to let the lead mare find the line, clicking his tongue to move the stragglers. 4 miles an hour, 60 miles, 15 hours if nothing went wrong. Things went wrong at dawn. The herd needed water. Cass found a stock tank in a dry wash, concrete basin built for cattle, still holding monsoon rainwater. He watered the herd in shifts, 50 at a time. 2 hours lost. 2 hours of standing in the open with stolen property while the sun climbed, and somewhere behind him, the fuse was burning. Because Dooley had done the math. Dooley had gone to the foreman. The foreman had checked the corral. And by sunrise, Pardo's men were riding north. He saw the dust at noon. Behind him, 8 miles south. A second dust cloud, riders moving fast, at least 6 men, maybe more. The herd raised its own dust, visible for miles, a beacon broadcasting his location across the desert floor. The reservation boundary was 12 miles ahead. 12 miles at 4 miles an hour was 3 hours. The riders behind at a gallop could close 8 miles in 1 hour. The math was catastrophic. Cass pushed the herd to a trot, then a canter. Dust exploded. The horses spread across the desert floor in a thundering line. He lost formation, the careful herd structure dissolving into a stampede of animals running because the animal behind them was running. Control was gone. Direction was all he had left. North. Just north. He rode the flank, screaming into the wind, turning the lead mare when she drifted east, cutting back to push the stragglers when they slowed. 12 miles of desert at a dead run with 200 horses and 6 armed men behind him, and the reservation boundary an invisible line on a map that existed in a government office and nowhere in the actual dirt. He hit the boundary, or where he believed the boundary was, based on the landmarks he'd memorized, at 3 in the afternoon. The riders behind pulled up. He could see them a mile back, 6 shapes on horseback, motionless in the heat shimmer, watching. They didn't cross. Reservation land without military authorization was a federal offense even Pardo's men wouldn't risk. Among the 6 riders, one sat slightly apart from the others, smaller, freckled, if Cass could have seen the distance. Dooley. Dooley, who had done the math and sold the answer for $70 of forgiven debt. Dooley, who was watching his only friend disappear into Apache land with 200 horses, and the knowledge that the friend he'd betrayed was now beyond anyone's reach except the people whose horses he was carrying. And the people whose horses he was carrying had not yet decided whether the man carrying them was a rescuer or a thief. They came out of the landscape like the desert had grown men. 20 warriors rising from behind boulders and mesquite in a canyon where the reservation's southern boundary met the foothills. They didn't ride. They stood. A human wall across the canyon floor. 20 rifles, Springfields, Sharps carbines, the second-hand weapons the Army issued to scouts who had bled for treaties that bled back. 20 barrels aimed at the one white man who had just driven 200 horses onto their land. This is where the story started. This is the canyon. This is the moment. 20 rifles and one question, and Cass Everett sitting on a winded horse with his hands visible and his own rifle still in its scabbard and every cell in his body telling him to run, while the part of him that had buried a brother with a fence rail marker, the part that recognized what it feels like to lose everything and have nobody care, that part told him to sit still, because sitting still is the most advanced technique there is. Whether the creature in front of you is a horse or a warrior or your own death, the technique is the same. Be still. Let them come to you. The man with the iron-gray hair stepped forward, 10 feet from Cass's horse. The assessment was total. Hands, visible, empty. Horse, winded, not abused. Herd, intact, every animal present. Face, pale blue eyes looking back without fear or performance. 20 seconds, a lifetime of context behind it. Years of white men who promised and broke, who signed and betrayed, who said yours and meant mine. Every white face carried the weight of every previous white face. Cass's face had to answer for all of them. Why? The warrior said. One word. English. Clear. The English of a man who had learned it for strategic reasons. Specifically, to understand the people who were systematically destroying his world. Cass could have said, because the debt is fake. Because Pardo lied. Because the ledger has 2 columns, and the numbers don't match. All true. All insufficient. Because the real answer came from a place that didn't speak in numbers. Because they're yours, Cass said, and a man named Pardo took them using a ledger that says your people owe money you don't owe. He billed the government for 80,000 pounds of flour and delivered 42,000. The difference is the debt he used to take your horses. The debt is arithmetic. The arithmetic is a lie. And thus horses are standing on your land right now because I know what it feels like to lose what's yours and have nobody in the world care enough to bring it back. The warrior studied him. Not the words, the face behind the words, the place where lies live, if lies are present. Whatever he found in Cass's pale blue eyes, the fence rail grave, the $4 weeks, the smaller column, it wasn't a lie. It was the flat, settled expression of a man who has made a decision and isn't looking for a reward because the decision was the reward. The warrior turned to the 20 men. He spoke in Apache, rapid, low. The warriors listened. They looked at Cass. They looked at the horses. They looked at each other. And then they did something that Cass Everett, the fence post, the hand, the man who had never mattered, was not prepared for. By the way, if this story has you locked in, hit subscribe and tell me which country you're watching from. Because what the 20 warriors do next, and what it costs, is the moment this story turns from a horse theft into something that will sit in your chest for days. They stepped forward, all 20, and formed a half circle around Cass. Not threatening, surrounding, the way a family surrounds a member they are claiming, and they whispered, not shouted, not chanted, whispered. 20 voices in unison, producing a sound that was louder than any shout because the volume was in the meaning, not the air. Now we are yours. 5 words, spoken by 20 men. And the words didn't mean what the audience might think. They didn't mean surrender. They didn't mean slavery. They meant something the Apache had practiced for centuries. A binding, an adoption, the claiming of a person into a circle of mutual responsibility. You are ours, and we are yours. You are responsible for us, and we are responsible for you. The binding goes both ways. It is witnessed by the land and the animals and the sky, and it cannot be broken by paper because it predates paper by 1,000 years. Cass's eyes filled, not dramatically, the way a cup fills when you pour slowly. The water rose and sat at the rim and didn't fall because a man who has been a fence post for 29 years doesn't know how to cry in front of people. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Some moments are too big for mouths. The eyes do the talking. And his eyes, pale blue, desert bleached, the eyes of a man who had never been claimed by anyone, said everything. But the warrior with iron-gray hair, whose name Cass would learn, was Alchesay, a White Mountain Apache scout who held the Medal of Honor for bravery in the Tonto Campaign of 1872–73, one of the most decorated men in the United States military and one of the most betrayed. Alchesay was not finished. He looked at Cass with an expression that was not warm. It was honest, and honest is harder than warm. You understand what these words cost, Alchesay said. Not a question, a warning. If you stay and the army comes, and the army will come because a white man named Pardo has already sent word, we fight. Not might fight. Fight. 20 men will stand between you and the soldiers. 20 men will die if the soldiers choose to kill. You have been claimed. Claimed people are defended. That is the law of the binding. It cannot be undone. The canyon went silent. The 200 horses grazed. The sun was setting. The canyon walls turning from red to orange to the deep purple that Arizona does better than any other place on earth. And Cass Everett stood inside a half-circle of 20 warriors and processed what he'd just been told. The adoption wasn't just an honor, it was a potential death sentence for 20 people. If the army came, and the army would come, 20 men would fight 30 cavalrymen to protect a cowboy they'd known for less than an hour. The beauty of the binding contained the blade of its consequence. He had been claimed, and the claim might kill the people who made it. 48 hours later, the army came, 30 cavalrymen from Fort Apache, led by a lieutenant named Barlow, young, West Point, the kind of officer who believed procedure was justice because he hadn't lived long enough to learn the distance between them, and riding beside the lieutenant in civilian clothes, pointing at Cass, Dooley, freckled, familiar, former friend, the man who had sold him for $70 of forgiven debt. "That's him," Dooley said, pointing from behind the cavalry line. His voice carried across the canyon the way all betrayals carry, clearly, specifically, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The man Cass had shared tobacco with on Saturday nights was delivering him to a rope, and the 20 warriors who had whispered, "Now we are yours," reached for their rifles. 20 Springfields aimed at 30 cavalrymen, the mathematics of a massacre. And Alchesay, Medal of Honor, scout, the man who had served the army loyally for a decade, stood between the two lines and made the most painful decision of the story. Not the most dramatic, the most painful. "Go with them," Alchesay said to Cass. Quiet, the voice of a man breaking his own law to save the person the law was designed to protect. "What?" Cass stared at him. "You claimed me. You said the binding can't be undone. The binding cannot be undone, but I will not let 20 men die for one man's first day as family. Go. The truth will do what our rifles cannot. Take the truth to their courts. Tell them about the 2 columns. And if their courts are honest, you will come back. And if their courts are not honest? He paused. Then we will know what the binding costs, and we will pay it. Cass looked at the 20 warriors with their rifles aimed at 30 soldiers. He looked at Barlow with his warrant. He looked at Dooley, who would not meet his eyes. He looked at Alchesay, the man who had just adopted him and was now releasing him, the way you release a bird you've caught, because holding it means crushing it. Cass put his hands forward. The chains went on. He walked toward the cavalry line, and behind him, 20 warriors lowered their rifles, not in surrender, but in the specific discipline of men who trust their leader enough to let the most important person in the canyon walk into enemy hands because the leader said the truth is stronger than a bullet. The truth had better be, because if it wasn't, 20 men would pick up those rifles again, and the binding would cost everything it promised. They took him to the territorial prison in Yuma, not Globe. Pardo had influence in Globe. Yuma, 300 miles south. A stone fortress on the Colorado River where the heat reached 120 degrees in summer, and the cells were designed for men the territory wanted to forget. The charge: theft of 200 horses. Value: $4,000. A hanging offense. Cass sat in a stone cell for 6 weeks while the investigation crawled through the territorial bureaucracy with the speed of a government that had no incentive to hurry. Pardo filed papers. Pardo's lawyer filed motions. The system that had allowed a contractor to steal 200 horses from a reservation was now being asked to determine whether the man who returned them was a criminal. The fox was investigating the henhouse, and the fox's lawyer was billing by the hour. 6 weeks. Cass sat in Yuma and stared at stone walls and thought about Alchesay's words. The truth will do what our rifles cannot. The truth was in a ledger on Pardo's desk, 2 columns, numbers that didn't match. But the ledger was in Pardo's office, and Pardo controlled access, and Pardo had 6 weeks to alter, destroy, or hide the evidence. The truth was a weapon only if someone could reach it before Pardo buried it. And from a cell in Yuma, Cass couldn't reach anything except the walls. Then, on the 43rd day, the courtroom door opened, and 4 men walked in. Not lawyers, not soldiers, not politicians. 4 Apache men in clean cavalry scout shirts, blue, pressed, the shirts they'd earned serving the United States Army. Each man wore something on his chest: a medal, bronze, 5-pointed star, the Congressional Medal of Honor. 4 Medal of Honor recipients, the most decorated Apache scouts in the history of the United States military, walked into a territorial courtroom in Tucson and sat in the front row and waited to be called as witnesses. Alchesay had ridden to Fort Apache. He had gathered the 3 other Apache scouts who held the Medal of Honor, men who had tracked Geronimo's raiders, men who had bled alongside cavalrymen, men the United States government had personally decorated for bravery, and he had ridden 300 miles to Tucson with them, not to fight, to testify. 4 men whose courage the nation had recognized walking into a courtroom to say, "The horses are ours." They were stolen by a contractor who billed the government for food he didn't deliver. The man in your prison returned them. The thief is not in chains. The man who undid the theft is. The judge listened. Alchesay spoke, in English, clear, precise, the English of a man who had learned the language to survive the people who spoke it. He described the deliveries: the flour that arrived light, the beef that arrived spoiled, the blankets that didn't arrive at all, the debt that was created from the gap between what was billed and what was delivered, the horses that were seized as payment for the gap. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 4 Medal of Honor ribbons in the front row did the shouting. the judge ordered Pardo's ledger seized. Federal marshals rode to Globe. They found the ledger. Pardo hadn't destroyed it because Pardo believed the ledger was his protection, not his confession. The same arrogance that had kept Skaggs's ledger on a shelf. The same blindness that afflicts men who have been getting away with theft so long they forget the theft is visible to anyone who reads the numbers. 2 columns. The numbers didn't match, not even close. Pardo was arrested. Fraud, embezzlement, false claims against the United States government. The reservation agent who had approved the horse seizure was dismissed. The horses, all 200, still grazing on White Mountain Apache land where Cass had delivered them, were officially confirmed as Apache property by order of the territorial court. And Cass Everett, the man who had been charged with stealing horses, had the charges dropped when the stolen property turned out to have been stolen first by the man who filed the complaint. The prison door opened. Cass walked out of Yuma into sunlight so bright it hurt after 6 weeks of stone walls. And standing outside the prison, not inside, outside, because Apache were not allowed inside territorial buildings without escort, alchesay waited. 4 Medal of Honor scouts stood behind him. They'd ridden 300 miles south to testify. Now they'd waited outside a prison for the door to open. "The truth did what our rifles could not," alchesay said, not smiling, honest. "Now come home." And Dooley. The audience wants to know about Dooley. Emmett Dooley, freckled, cheerful, the man who sold his friend for $70 of forgiven debt, was present at the trial. Pardo had brought him as a witness. Dooley testified that he saw Cass take the horses. The prosecutor asked if Dooley knew the horses were Apache property taken on a fraudulent debt. Dooley's face did the flicker, the same tightening around the eyes that Cass had seen in the bunkhouse a year ago. "I knew the numbers didn't look right," Dooley said, "but I owed Mr. Pardo money, and a man who owes doesn't ask questions." The courtroom heard a man describe selling his friend to pay a debt. The courtroom heard the mathematics of betrayal. $70 for a friendship, the same way Eustace sold Honora for 40. Different numbers, same arithmetic. And Cass, sitting in the courtroom, looked at Dooley and felt something that was not anger and not forgiveness, but the specific exhaustion of a man who finally understands why the fence post is always alone. Because the fence post doesn't have $70 to owe, and a man who owes nothing is a man nobody can turn. Cass went home. Not to Pardo's ranch. There was nothing there except the smell of a corral that had held stolen horses and a bunkhouse where a friend had done the math and decided friendship was worth less than $70. He went to the reservation, to the canyon, to the 20 warriors who had whispered 5 words and then let him walk away in chains because their leader trusted the truth more than the rifles. He stayed. Not because he became Apache. He didn't. He was a white cowboy who sat in their circle and ate their food and learned enough Apache to say thank you, and never learned goodbye because he didn't plan to need it. He worked with the horses, the same horses he'd driven 60 miles through the desert. He taught the younger riders what he knew about breaking, the quiet method, the patience, the waiting. They taught him what they knew, bareback commands, the whistle language, the way a horse reads a rider's weight shift before the reins move. 2 traditions meeting in a corral, 2 ways of knowing the same animal. And the knowing was the binding, not the ceremony, not the 5 words, the daily act of standing beside someone and learning from them and teaching them and calling that, without ever using the word, family, and the phrase, "Now we are yours." It lived in the territory for years, not as a story about a white man saving native people. The Apache didn't need saving. They needed their horses back. What Cass provided wasn't salvation. It was logistics. He had access to the corral. He knew the canyon routes. He could drive a herd, and he could do it without being shot on sight. Because a white man driving horses across the desert is a rancher moving stock, but an Apache driving the same horses is a raider committing a capital offense. Cass's whiteness was his contribution, his invisibility, his fence-postness. The very quality that had made him nobody his entire life was the quality that let him do the one thing that mattered. And the Apache, who understood the mechanics of the territory better than any white man alive, recognized it. "Now we are yours," meant, "We see what you used. We see that the thing that made you invisible to your own people made you visible to us." That's not heroism. That's partnership. And partnership, real partnership, the kind that survives a prison sentence and a betrayal and 20 rifles and a canyon at sunset, is the rarest thing the frontier ever produced. The horses grazed. The canyon held its silence. Alchesay sat beside Cass one evening and said nothing for a long time, the specific nothing of two men who have been through a thing that doesn't need to be discussed because the discussing would make it smaller. Then Alchesay said, "The binding is not undone." "I know," Cass said. "It was never undone. Not when I told you to go. Not when the chains went on. Not in the prison. The binding is not in the body. It is in the decision. You decided to bring the horses. I decided to let you leave. Both decisions are the binding. The binding lives in the choosing, not in the staying." Cass sat with that. 2 men in a canyon. 200 horses. A sky full of stars that didn't care about ledgers or columns or the specific arithmetic of a territory that measured everything in dollars and nothing in people. The stars cared about one thing: whether the people beneath them were surviving. And the people beneath them, a cowboy who had been a fence post, and a warrior who had been a Medal of Honor holder, and 20 men who had whispered 5 words in a canyon at sunset, were surviving. Together. Which is the only way surviving means anything at all. If this story stayed with you, the frontier has more stories, and the best ones are about the people who returned what was stolen, not because they were heroes, but because they knew what it felt like to be the smaller column.